The young black girl was locked in the attic, a prisoner in a place where no child should ever be. The mountain man's actions that followed would forever change the course of everyone's lives. What happened next in those remote hills would send shockwaves through the entire community. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, bending the trees into twisted silhouettes against the gray winter sky. John Smith trudged through knee-deep snow, his weathered boots crunching on the frosted earth with each labored step. The bitter cold had driven him farther from his isolated cabin than he'd intended. And now darkness threatened as heavy clouds rolled across the mountain ridges surrounding Hollow Creek. Shelter was his only thought as the temperature plummeted. The abandoned brown farmhouse loomed ahead, its weathered clapboards and sagging porch offering the promise of respite from the merciless elements. John hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. The villagers made sure of that, crossing to the other side of the path whenever they spotted the bear of the ridge approaching. He forced the frozen door open with his shoulder, wincing as splinters bit into his calloused palm. The interior was a tomb of memories, dust-covered furniture standing like ghosts in the gloom. John had just begun to brush snow from his heavy coat when he heard it. Sharp, desperate knocking above his head, as if the walls themselves begged for mercy. The Lenhador froze, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone was in the attic. Hello? His voice sounded strange after so many silent days. No answer came, only another faint knock. John's heart pounded against his ribs as he scaled the creaking stairs, each step protesting beneath his weight. The air grew thicker as he climbed, heavy with the smell of damp wood and ash. At the top landing, a narrow door hung partially open. "I'm coming in," he announced, pushing the door wider. Dust motes danced in the thin shaft of fading daylight that pierced through a small window. The attic seemed empty at first glance, just old trunks and forgotten furniture draped in cobwebs. Then he saw her. In the dim corner, a young black girl huddled against the wall. Her eyes, wide and haunted, reflected terror as she clutched a ragged doll to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, her thin frame swallowed by clothes too large and too worn for the brutal mountain winter. John Smith approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. The floorboards groaned beneath him, and the child pressed herself harder against the wall, as if wishing she could disappear into it. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, crouching to appear less threatening. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please, don't send me back." The words hung in the frigid air between them, a desperate plea that pierced through John's carefully constructed solitude. Outside, the storm intensified, sealing them both within the forgotten farmhouse as night descended over Hollow Creek. John Smith's boots crunched through the fresh snow as he carried the trembling girl down from the farmhouse toward Hollow Creek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, but offered little warmth against the bitter cold. He had wrapped her in his worn woolen coat, which swallowed her small frame entirely. The village square fell silent as John approached. Mothers pulled their curious children behind their skirts, and men paused their work, tools still in hand. No one stepped forward to claim knowledge of the mysterious child. "I found her locked in the brown farmhouse attic," John announced, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Does anyone know who she belongs to?" Agnes Johnson emerged from the crowd, her severe face pinched with suspicion. The village matriarch surveyed the girl with cold eyes before addressing the lumberman. "The bear of the ridge finally lost his mind," she muttered loud enough for others to hear. "First you abandon your family duties, now you bring strange children down from the mountain." Several villagers nodded in agreement, their gazes deliberately avoiding the girl's face. The child pressed herself closer to John's chest, her dark eyes wide with fear. "She needs food and proper shelter," Mary Brown said quietly. the healer's compassion evident despite her hesitation to challenge Agnes openly. John turned away from their judgment, carrying the girl back to his isolated cabin. Inside, he stoked the fire until flames leapt high, filling the small space with golden light and warmth. His calloused hands, accustomed to wielding an axe, moved with surprising gentleness as he offered her a chunk of bread and a cup of water. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, kneeling to meet her eye level. The girl accepted the bread but remained silent, studying him with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The pines remember what people forget," she said, her fingers tracing patterns in the wooden table. "When the mountain breathes, secrets rise like mist." John frowned, recognizing fragments of old legends passed down through generations in Hollow Creek. Tales of mountain spirits and ancient promises that no child her age should know, especially that night as snow fell heavily outside. John made a decision that would change everything. He cleared a small space near the fire, arranged blankets into a makeshift bed, and told the girl she could stay until they found where she belonged. He didn't yet understand that in sheltering her, he had set in motion events that would crack open the mountain's oldest secrets. The first breath of spring swept through Hollow Creek, melting snow into rivulets that carved paths down the mountainside. After months of bitter cold, villagers emerged from their homes like hibernating creatures, blinking in the welcome warmth. The annual Renewal Festival transformed the village square into a tapestry of movement and color. Children danced around towering straw figures, their faces glowing in the firelight. These carefully crafted effigies represented the hardships of winter, disease, hunger, and sorrow, soon to be consumed by cleansing flames. John Smith stood at the edge of the gathering, his weathered face softened as he watched the young girl beside him. Elise, he'd named her, after his mother. The name had come naturally one evening as they shared a simple meal in his cabin. She'd accepted it with a solemn nod, as if reclaiming something long lost. Agnes Johnson moved through the crowd like a shadow, her gray hair pulled tight beneath a woolen shawl. The village matron's eyes narrowed when she spotted the Lenador and his ward. She clutched the arm of Mary Brown, who was arranging healing herbs on a small wooden table. "That child doesn't belong here," Agnes hissed, her voice barely audible above the celebratory drums. "John brings her to our sacred festival as if she's one of us." Mary's hands stilled over her herbs. "The girl has harmed no one," the healer replied carefully, aware of Agnes's influence over the villagers. "Not yet," Agnes countered, watching as Elise approached the nearest effigy with wide, curious eyes. "Outsiders bring change, and change tears at the fabric of what we've built. Mark my words." Several villagers nodded in agreement, their whispers spreading like wildfire through the gathering. When Elise reached toward one of the smaller effigies, a woman pulled her child away with a sharp intake of breath. John noticed the reaction, his shoulders tensing as he moved protectively toward the girl. He'd seen this before. Fear disguised as tradition, suspicion masquerading as wisdom. Agnes seized the moment, addressing those nearby. "Our ways have kept us safe for generations. This mountain provides for those who respect its balance." Her voice carried authority, earned through years of guiding Hollow Creek through hardship. "That child appeared from nowhere. We know nothing of her." Elise seemed oblivious to the tension, her attention captured by the dancing flames as the first effigy was set ablaze. The fire reflected in her dark eyes, twin flames that held secrets John was only beginning to understand. The village matron watched them closely throughout the evening, convinced that the fragile piece of Hollow Creek hung in the balance. What troubled Agnes most wasn't simply the girl's mysterious arrival, but how quickly John had transformed from the solitary bear of the ridge into someone willing to challenge the village's unspoken rules. Elise's laughter broke the silence in John's cabin, piercing the loneliness that had settled like dust over the years. The sound startled John Smith at first. His home had known only the crackle of fire and the whisper of his own thoughts for so long. He watched as the young girl explored the small space, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn furniture he'd crafted during endless winter nights. "You want to learn?" he asked one morning, noticing her curious gaze following his movements. When she nodded, something shifted in his chest, a warmth he'd nearly forgotten. Day by day, John taught Elise the rhythms of mountain life. His calloused hands guided hers as they set rabbit snares along the creek bed. "Gentle now," he murmured, showing her how to bend the wire without breaking it. "The forest provides, but only if we approach with respect." The lenador demonstrated how to split kindling with his battered axe, standing behind her as she swung the tool with surprising strength. Her determination reminded him of himself as a boy, before exile and grief had carved him hollow. "Listen," John would say during their walks, stopping suddenly amid the pines. "The mountain speaks." Elise would close her eyes, her face serene as she absorbed the language of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. Sometimes she'd respond with those strange riddles of hers, words that seemed woven from older threads than her young years should know. But in Hollow Creek, such moments of connection bred suspicion. When John and the girl ventured into the village for supplies, conversations would halt. Mothers pulled their children closer, eyeing Elise as though her very presence might contaminate. "That man's bewitched the child," Agnes Johnson declared after Sunday gathering, her voice carrying intentionally to where John stood. "No normal girl would choose to stay with the bear of the ridge." Others whispered more sinister theories. "He conjured her from mountain spirits," claimed one elder, crossing himself, "trying to win our favor after what he did." Mary Brown, mixing herbs in her shop, defended them quietly. The child needed shelter. John offered it. Where's the evil in that? But even the healer's words couldn't stem the tide of gossip. That evening, returning to the cabin, John noticed Elise's shoulders had grown tense, her usual chatter silenced by the village's cold reception. "They fear what they don't understand," he explained, stoking the fire higher against the spring chill. "I've known that burden for years." Elise looked up at him, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "Then we understand each other," she said simply, returning to the wooden figure she was carving, a small bear, its features emerging from the timber like a secret long kept. John nodded, realizing that in teaching this child to survive, he was remembering how to live. The summer barter fair transformed the village square of Hollow Creek into a tapestry of color and sound. Blankets spread across the ground displayed handcrafted goods, carved wooden spoons, jars of preserved berries, and leather goods tanned through the winter months. John Smith stood at the periphery, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, feeling the weight of dozens of stares burning hotter than the midday sun beating down on his shoulders. Elise moved differently than the other children. While they scurried between stalls with practiced restraint, she flowed like water, finding its path downhill. When the musicians began to play, the girl was drawn to the melody as if by an invisible thread. Flutes carved from alder wood sang haunting tunes that seemed to awaken something within her. Without warning or inhibition, she began to dance. Her small feet beat rhythms against the packed earth, complex patterns that seemed to echo something ancient, something the ridge itself remembered, but the villagers had long forgotten. Her movements weren't the careful, measured steps taught to Hollow Creek children. These were wild, free expressions that spoke of deeper woods and older stories. The children of the village watched, spellbound. Some even took tentative steps forward, their bodies swaying slightly as if longing to join her. For a moment, the invisible barrier between Elise and the community thinned. "Get back here, all of you!" Agnes Johnson's voice cut through the music like a blade. The village matron's face was tight with disapproval as she hissed at mothers to collect their children. "Have you forgotten what we stand for in Hollow Creek?" Her eyes, hard as river stones, never left the dancing girl. The women obeyed, pulling reluctant children away by their sleeves and shoulders. The crowd shifted, creating a visible circle of emptiness around Elise, who gradually slowed her movements as the rejection registered on her face. In the shadows cast by the trading tents, Caleb Davis observed the entire scene with calculating interest. The traveling merchant's fingers drummed against his leather coin purse as his mind worked through possibilities. Unlike the villagers who saw danger in the girl's difference, he saw opportunity. A child who danced like that, who carried mystery like a cloak around her shoulders, people in larger towns would pay good money to witness such a spectacle. He watched as John stepped forward to place a protective hand on Elise's shoulder, guiding her away from the staring villagers. The bond between them was obvious, but bonds could be broken. Every person had their price, even mountain men with fierce eyes and stubborn hearts. Caleb smiled to himself, already plotting how to turn her mystery into profit. All he needed was the right moment, the right offer, and patience, something a successful merchant cultivated alongside his inventory. The fireplace crackled softly as John Smith settled into his worn chair, nursing a cup of pine needle tea. Outside, twilight painted Hollow Creek in shades of purple and gold. He watched Elise arrange her few possessions on the small shelf he'd built her. A pine cone, a smooth river stone, and that curious ragged doll she never let out of her sight. With careful movements, Elise placed her doll beside a wooden figurine John had almost forgotten. The lenyador froze, his cup suspended mid-air. The two objects, her doll and his talisman, shared an unmistakable resemblance, down to the distinctive notch carved at the base. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the popping fire. The talisman was his own creation, whittled during long nights after his brother's passing. Each cut of his knife had been a prayer, each groove a memory of their childhood before bitterness tore them apart. After the feud that left him exiled on the ridge, John had crafted dozens of these figures, leaving them at the forest's edge as offerings to a reconciliation that never came. Elise hummed softly, running her small fingers over both figures. "They belong together," she said simply. John set his cup down, memories washing over him like the creek after spring thaw. He hadn't touched his carving tools in years, the pain too raw, the guilt too heavy. Yet here was his handiwork, paired with this child's treasured companion. "Elise," he began, choosing his words carefully, "that wooden figure, I made it, for my brother." The admission felt like stones lifted from his chest. "Where did you get your doll? It looks just like my talisman." The girl's eyes, usually bright with mischief, grew distant. She clutched the doll to her chest, rocking slightly. For a moment, John feared she'd retreat into silence, as she had during those first difficult weeks. Instead, she whispered, "From the house where shadows live, where beings remember footsteps and walls hold breath." She looked up at him, her expression suddenly ancient. "The house remembers you, mountain man. It remembers everything." A chill crawled up John's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. The abandoned farmhouse where he'd found her, his brother's home before their falling out. The attic where Elise had been hidden. He reached out tentatively, his rough hand hovering over the matched pair of figures. The connection was undeniable, a thread linking past to present, binding his story to hers in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "perhaps we should visit that house again." Elise nodded, a small smile playing at her lips as she arranged the figures side by side, guardians in the gathering darkness. John Smith winced as Mary Brown gently cleaned the gash on his leg. The injury had come suddenly. A moment's distraction while felling a pine near the eastern ridge had sent his axe slicing through his worn trousers and into flesh. Blood had soaked the fabric by the time he'd limped back to his cabin. "You're fortunate it's not deeper," the healer said, her fingers working methodically as she applied a pungent salve. Another inch and you might have lost the leg entirely. Mary had hesitated at his threshold earlier, her medical bag clutched tightly against her chest. Something in her eyes betrayed an inner conflict, as though crossing into John's domain carried weight beyond a simple house call. Only when Elise appeared behind him, small hand tugging at his sleeve, did the healer's shoulders relax slightly. "I've seen worse on stubborn men who think they're immortal," John replied through gritted teeth. The cabin smelled of pine resin and the herbs Mary had crushed for his poultice. Outside, the last light of day filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Elise moved silently around them, placing a cup of steaming tea beside the healer before retreating to her corner where she watched with solemn eyes. The girl's presence seemed to unsettle Mary, who kept glancing in her direction with a mixture of concern and something deeper, guilt perhaps. As night fell and the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Mary finally spoke what had clearly been burdening her. "I've treated her before," she whispered, nodding toward Elise, who had fallen asleep wrapped in John's old quilt. The confession hung heavy in the air. John's hands stilled on the wooden cup he'd been holding. "It was months ago, before you found her," Mary continued, her voice barely audible above the popping of the fire. "She was feverish, malnourished. Someone brought her to me in the dead of night, made me swear an oath of silence." The healer's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I've kept that promise until now." "Who?" John asked, his voice rough with emotion. Mary shook her head. "Someone powerful in the village. Someone afraid of what Elise knows." She gathered her supplies with trembling hands. "I've said too much already." The unspoken truth pressed between them like the shadows on the cabin walls, dark, heavy, and impossible to ignore. John looked at the sleeping child, understanding now why the village's silence had been so complete, why Agnes Johnson's eyes burned with such determination whenever Elise was mentioned. "She's safe here," John said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at his heart. Mary nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "For now," she whispered. "For now." As summer's golden hues faded into autumn's amber embrace, Harlan Johnson grew increasingly restless. The blacksmith's broad shoulders tensed whenever he spotted John Smith and Elise walking through the village. Each day, the whispers about the mysterious girl grew louder, and Harlan saw an opportunity to claim the respect he'd long coveted from Hollow Creek's residents. The autumn blessing ceremony arrived with its familiar rhythms, rows of cornstalks illuminated by flickering candles, the scent of harvest filling the crisp evening air. Villagers gathered in concentric circles around the ceremonial fire pit, their faces glowing orange in the dancing light. Agnes Johnson stood at the center, her weathered hands raised as she recited the traditional prayers that had protected their mountain home for generations. Harlan watched from the edge of the crowd, his calloused fingers nervously tracing the hammer pendant at his neck. When John arrived with Elise at his side, the blacksmith's jaw tightened. The girl's presence at their sacred ritual felt like a violation to him, a breach in the protective walls of tradition. "This has gone on long enough," Harlan suddenly announced, his deep voice cutting through Agnes's prayer. The crowd fell silent as he stepped forward, positioning himself between John and the ceremonial fire. "Return the girl to where you found her," he demanded, pointing a thick finger at Elise. "For the good of all." His words rang across the gathering, echoing against the mountainside. "We don't know who or what she is. Our crops faltered after her arrival. The spring ran low. These are signs." Several villagers nodded in agreement, emboldening the blacksmith. He stood taller, shoulders squared, finally feeling the importance he craved. John's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes hardened like river stones. He placed a protective hand on Elise's shoulder, who watched the confrontation with unnervingly calm eyes. "She stays with me," John replied, his voice quiet but firm. "She's done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Harlan scoffed. "Strange chants in the night? Children neglecting chores to hear her stories?" Mary Brown breaking healer's tradition to treat an outsider? The tension thickened as villagers looked between the two men, one seeking validation through confrontation, the other standing on principle alone. "I won't abandon her to ease your fear," John stated simply. Harlan stepped closer, his frame imposing. "Then you choose her over Hollow Creek's safety." John didn't flinch. "I choose what's right." The crowd parted in uneasy silence as John guided Elise away from the ceremony, their figures silhouetted against the harvest moon. The blacksmith watched them go, his moment of authority slipping away with each step they took. The villagers returned to their prayers, but the ritual's harmony had been irreparably fractured, just like the community itself. The children of Hollow Creek had never seen anything like Elise. They gathered beneath John Smith's windows, abandoning their chores despite knowing the stern reprimands that would await them at home. They crouched in the tall grass, straining to hear her voice as she wove tales that seemed to rise from the mountain itself. "The pines remember those who came before," Elise would say, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air. "They bend to whisper secrets when no one's watching." The children listened entranced as she described spirits that danced in moonlight, and rivers that carried messages from ancestors long gone. Even Thomas Johnson, Agnes's grandson, defied his grandmother's warning. She paced the cabin floor, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "It's coming," she murmured, pressing her palm against the window glass. Thunder cracked like a whip across the valley, and lightning split the darkness. Rain lashed against the cabin walls as if demanding entry. The Lenador moved to comfort her, but stopped when Elise began to sing. Her voice started low, a strange rhythmic chant unlike anything John had heard before. The words weren't English, nor any language he recognized from travelers passing through Hollow Creek. They seemed older, pulled from the earth itself. As the storm raged fiercer, Elise's voice grew stronger. She stood at the open door, facing the tempest, her small frame silhouetted against flashes of lightning. The chant rose and fell like waves, somehow carrying above the howling wind. Then something extraordinary happened. The mountain seemed to answer. Her song echoed back, amplified and transformed, rolling through the valley like distant drums. For several heartbeats, the storm itself appeared to pause, thunder holding its breath between strikes. Mary Brown, hurrying home with her healing satchel, stopped in her tracks when she heard it. The curandera crossed herself instinctively, recognizing power she couldn't name. In homes throughout Hollow Creek, villagers felt the strange resonance in their bones. Old women who had kept tradition for decades looked up from their hearths, suddenly uncertain. Children slipped from their beds to press faces against rain-streaked windows. For one suspended moment, as Elise's voice melded with the mountain's reply, even the oldest traditions of Hollow Creek faltered before something more ancient still. The whispers began as soon as the storm clouds retreated. Villagers gathered in small clusters throughout Hollow Creek, their voices hushed, yet urgent. Some claimed John Smith had performed ancient rituals during the thunderstorm, summoning mountain spirits that answered Elise's strange chanting. Others insisted the girl herself was an omen, her arrival foretelling disaster for their isolated community. "Did you hear her voice during the lightning?" Martha Wilson asked her neighbor. No child should know such words. Agnes Johnson held court at the village square, her weathered face tight with conviction as she recited the prophecy passed down through generations. "A child hidden in beams will crack the mountain open." The matriarch's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her shawl. "Our ancestors warned us. This girl brings change, and change brings suffering." John heard these whispers as he traded pelts for supplies. The storekeeper avoided his eyes, hurriedly counting coins before pushing them across the counter. The lumberman felt the weight of suspicion pressing down, heavier than the axe he carried on his shoulder, but he refused to bow beneath it. That evening, as Elise sat by the fire weaving pine needles into patterns. A realization struck him with such force that he nearly dropped his cup. The abandoned farmhouse where he'd found her, that attic with its creaking floorboards and smell of forgotten things, had once belonged to his brother. "The brown farmhouse," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Elise looked up, her dark eyes reflecting firelight. "The house remembers," she said simply. John paced the small cabin, memories flooding back. His brother had died 5 winters ago, after their bitter feud over land rights and old family wounds. John had never returned to that property, too burdened by guilt and grief. Now his past and present collided in the form of this mysterious child. He knelt beside Elise. "How did you come to be in that attic?" he asked gently. She clutched her ragged doll tighter, her fingers tracing the wooden features that so resembled John's own talisman. "The woman with angry eyes put me there," she whispered. "Said I must wait until the mountain was ready." The ferryman's wife had reported seeing Agnes walking alone toward the abandoned property weeks before John found Elise. Could the matriarch herself be connected to this mystery? The thought chilled him more than the autumn wind. Outside, the villagers continued their worried conversations. Inside, John made a silent promise to protect Elise, regardless of prophecy or past. The mountain had already taken his brother and his place among his people. It would not take this child too. "We make our own destiny," he told her firmly, stoking the fire against the growing darkness. Caleb Davis approached John's cabin as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines. The merchant's boots barely made a sound on the packed earth, his practiced stealth betraying years of catching people unaware. John was chopping wood, his axe rhythmically splitting logs for the coming cold. "Quite the talk you've caused in these mountains," Caleb said, leaning against a tree with calculated casualness. His smile never reached his eyes as he produced a small leather pouch. The coins inside clinked together with a seductive promise. John paused, resting his weathered hands on the axe handle. He'd seen men like the merchant before, wolves dressed in sheep's clothing, measuring everything by what profit it might yield. "The girl," Caleb continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "she's special, different. People would pay good money to see someone like her." He tossed the pouch, letting it land with a heavy thud on the chopping block. "She'll see the world beyond this backwater, cities, oceans, and you'll be free of all this suspicion." The lenyador's eyes narrowed, noting how the traveler's gaze kept darting toward the cabin where Elise was preparing dinner. The coins gleamed in the fading light, enough to start a new life somewhere else, away from Hollow Creek's whispers and Agnes Johnson's condemning stares. "Think about it," the merchant pressed. "What future does she have here? They'll never accept her. But with me, she'll be a marvel, a curiosity people will travel miles to witness." John's fingers tightened around the axe handle until his knuckles whitened. He could see through the scheme clearly. Elise in a cage of spectacle, her spirit slowly crushed for others' entertainment. Her mysterious connection to the mountain exploited until nothing remained of the brave child who sang through storms. "Get off my land," John said, his voice quiet but hard as iron. Caleb's friendly facade slipped. "Don't be a fool. This village will turn on you both when winter gets harsh. They're already halfway there." Inside the cabin, Elise appeared at the window, her dark eyes watching the exchange with an ancient wariness no child should possess. When their gazes met, John felt a resolve settle in his chest, solid as the mountain itself. He kicked the pouch of coins back toward Caleb's feet. "She's not for sale." That evening, as they shared a simple meal by the fire, John reached across the table and took Elise's small hand in his calloused one. "You are safe with me," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't let them take you. Not him, not anyone." Elise nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. For the first time since he'd found her in that forgotten attic, she smiled without shadows. "We need to hunt," he told Elise one morning, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The girl nodded, her dark eyes solemn as she wrapped herself in layers of worn blankets. John had taught her to track during the warmer months, but winter hunting was different, more desperate, more dangerous. They ventured into the forest before dawn, the sky still ink-black above the pines. The Lenhador moved with practiced stealth despite his bulk, showing Elise how to place her feet in his larger tracks to conserve energy. The cold bit through their clothes, making each breath painful. "The animals hide deeper when snow comes," John explained, his voice barely audible above the wind. "We must go where others won't." By midday, they had pushed farther into the wilderness than John had intended. Elise's cheeks were raw from the cold, but she never complained. The girl who had once been trapped in an attic now moved through the forest with growing confidence, her eyes scanning for signs of life among the barren trees. The storm caught them unaware. One moment the sky was clear, the next a wall of white descended, erasing the world around them. John grabbed Elise's hand, his heart pounding with sudden fear. They couldn't see more than 3 feet ahead. "Stay close," he commanded, pulling her against his side. The wind howled, driving needles of ice against their faces. They stumbled forward, disoriented, their tracks filling almost as soon as they were made. Panic threatened to overwhelm John as the temperature dropped further. His thoughts turned to the stories of mountain men found frozen, standing upright like statues in the snow. He couldn't let that happen to Elise. He couldn't fail her. They nearly collapsed from exhaustion when John spotted it, a fallen log where he had set a snare weeks earlier. By some miracle, the trap remained untouched by other predators. A rabbit, plump despite the season, hung lifeless in the wire. "Look," he whispered, his voice cracking with relief. Elise's tired face broke into a smile as she reached out to touch their prize. It wasn't much, but it meant survival. As John secured their catch, the girl gathered kindling from beneath the protective overhang of a massive pine. Together they huddled, sharing body heat as John struck his flint. The tiny flame that caught represented everything: hope, resilience, life itself. In its glow, Elise's face shone with quiet determination. "We'll make it home," John promised, and for the first time in years, he truly believed in tomorrow. The winter solstice vigil cast long shadows across Hollow Creek as villagers trudged up the ridge, their lanterns swinging like fragile stars against the darkness. John Smith stood apart from the others, his weathered face illuminated by flickering light as he watched Elise beside him, her small frame wrapped in layers of wool against the biting cold. The tradition was ancient, older than the oldest resident. Each year, the community would gather on the highest point, their lanterns forming a circle of light to guide the sun back from its winter retreat. But tonight, the wind howled with unusual ferocity, as if the mountain itself sought to extinguish their hope. Agnes Johnson took her place at the center, her gray hair whipping around her face like angry snakes. "We stand as our ancestors stood," she began, her voice trembling against the gale. The villagers huddled closer, shoulders touching as they strained to hear the familiar words that had carried them through countless winters. The children clutched their lanterns with white-knuckled hands, their eyes darting between the matriarch and Elise. Over the months, they had come to see the mysterious girl as something more than human, a keeper of secrets, a teller of tales that made the forest come alive. Now, as darkness pressed in from all sides, they looked to her with desperate hope. One by one, the lanterns began to flicker and die. A child sobbed, an elder whispered prayers. The blacksmith Harlan cursed under his breath as he tried to shield his flame with calloused hands. Agnes's voice faltered mid-chant, the wind stealing her words and scattering them across the ridge. Panic rippled through the gathering as more lights went out. The curandera, Mary Brown, reached for her neighbor's hand, her eyes reflecting the last struggling flames. Then Elise stepped forward. The girl moved with quiet certainty, her steps deliberate against the frozen ground. John watched, his heart in his throat, as she raised her small hands toward the sky. For a moment, silence fell, as if the mountain held its breath. Elise began to sing. Not the traditional chant of Hollow Creek, but something older, something that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the howling wind like a blade of pure light. The remaining lanterns steadied. The villagers stared, transfixed, as Elise's song wove through the darkness, each note a thread of gold in the black tapestry of night. Even Agnes stood motionless, her face a mask of disbelief and reluctant wonder. "She's calling the light back," whispered a child, and no one contradicted him. John felt something crack inside his chest. Pride and fear intermingled as he watched the girl he'd protected become a beacon for an entire community. In her voice, he heard not just survival, but defiance, a refusal to surrender to darkness or doubt. And somehow, impossibly, the wind began to calm. The lanterns blazed to life, their golden light cutting through the darkness as the storm subsided. Elise stood at the center of the ridge, her small figure silhouetted against the clearing sky, her voice still echoing across the valley. The villagers of Hollow Creek stared in awe, their faces illuminated by the sudden brilliance that seemed to follow in the child's wake. "The girl called the light back," whispered a woman, clutching her own lantern with trembling fingers. Children pressed forward, eyes wide with wonder, no longer held back by their parents' cautious hands. John Smith watched from a few paces behind, his weathered face softened by pride. For months, he had sheltered Elise against the suspicion and fear of the village, standing firm against threats and whispers. Now, as the wind died down and stars emerged overhead, he saw the shift in the villagers' expressions, from fear to something resembling respect. Agnes Johnson stood rigid among the crowd, her authority momentarily forgotten as the impossible unfolded before her. The matriarch's lips pressed into a thin line, her prophecies and warnings suddenly hollow in the face of Elise's courage. "I've never seen anything like it," Mary Brown murmured, moving to stand beside John. The healer's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The storm should have taken every flame." John nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He had come to these mountains seeking solitude after his brother's death, building walls of silence and routine around his grief. But when he found Elise hiding in that forgotten attic, something had cracked within him, a fissure in the ice he'd wrapped around his heart. Harlan approached cautiously, his earlier challenge forgotten. "The child has strong magic," the blacksmith admitted, his voice gruff with reluctant admiration. "Not magic," John finally said, "courage." As the villagers began their descent back to Hollow Creek, many paused to nod at Elise or offer quiet words of thanks. Children darted close, touching her sleeve before racing away with nervous laughter. The girl who had been feared as a curse was now being seen as something else entirely, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Later, as they walked home through snow-covered pines, Elise slipped her small hand into John's calloused palm. He realized then that in choosing to protect her, he had protected himself as well, from the isolation that had nearly consumed him. The warmth of connection had seeped through the cracks in his defenses, thawing what had long been frozen. "We belong here now," Elise said simply, her words hanging in the clear night air. John squeezed her hand gently. For the first time in years, he believed it might be true. The village elders gathered in the small meeting hall, their faces illuminated by the amber glow of oil lamps. Mary Brown stood before them, her weathered hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. For weeks, she had carried the burden of knowledge, torn between her loyalty to Agnes and the truth she witnessed in Elise's eyes. "I can remain silent no longer," Mary announced, her voice gaining strength with each word. "What we fear in this child is nothing but our own shadows, given form by ancient words misremembered." Agnes Johnson rose from her seat, her face tightening with indignation. "You forget yourself, healer," she warned, but Mary stood her ground. "I forget nothing," Mary replied. "I remember too well. The prophecy you cling to, a child hidden in beams will crack the mountain open, was never a warning of destruction. It was a promise of renewal." The elders murmured among themselves as Mary revealed how Agnes had twisted the old saying to maintain her grip on Hollow Creek. The prophecy spoke not of disaster, but of transformation. A child whose presence would break open the rigid traditions that had calcified around their hearts. "I treated Elise months before John found her," Mary confessed, her voice catching. "She was hiding from someone in this very village who wished her harm. I swore to protect her, and in my cowardice, I kept silent too long." John Smith watched from the doorway, his presence a silent testament to Mary's words. Beside him, Elise stood tall despite her small frame, her eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. "The mountain did not crack with destruction when she sang during the solstice," Mary continued. "It opened to let light in, just as the prophecy foretold." Agnes shook her head, desperation etched across her features. "We cannot abandon what has kept us safe for generations," she insisted. Mary approached Elise slowly, removing the intricately embroidered sash that marked her position as the village healer. With reverence, she placed it at the girl's feet, then knelt before her. "This child has weathered our coldest storms and our cruelest scorn," Mary said, her eyes meeting each elder's gaze in turn. "She has shown more courage than those who would cast her out. If we cannot begin again, if we cannot see with new eyes, then perhaps we are the ones who threaten Hollow Creek's future, not her." The silence that followed hung heavy as mountain fog. Then, one by one, the elders rose, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement of a truth too powerful to deny. Even Agnes remained seated, her certainty finally giving way to doubt. Outside, the first spring flowers pushed through the snow, stubborn, resilient, and unafraid of the light. The horseshoe gleamed in Harlan Johnson's calloused hands, still warm from the forge. The burly blacksmith approached Elise with uncharacteristic gentleness, kneeling to meet her eyes. "For protection," Harlan said, offering the charm, "I made it myself." His voice, usually booming across the village square, had softened to a respectful murmur. Elise accepted the gift with both hands, tracing the iron curves with delicate fingers. John Smith watched from nearby, his weathered face betraying a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. The same man who had once challenged him before the entire village was now bowing his head to the child he'd tried to cast out. "Thank you," Elise whispered, hanging the horseshoe from a leather cord around her neck. The metal caught the afternoon light, sending tiny reflections dancing across her face. Word of the blacksmith's gesture spread quickly through Hollow Creek. By sunset, children had gathered around John's cabin, their curious faces pressed against windows and doorframes. They called for Elise, begging to hear the song that had calmed the winter storm during the solstice vigil. "Please teach us," a freckled boy pleaded, his eyes wide with wonder. "The chant that steadied the mountain." Elise hesitated, looking to John for guidance. The mountain man nodded, his silent permission all she needed. Soon her clear voice rose in the twilight air, teaching the village children rhythms as old as the ridge itself. Their young voices joined hers, creating a harmony that drifted through the pines. Parents who had once pulled their children away now stood at a distance, listening. Even Agnes Johnson watched from her porch, her stern features softened by something almost like regret. "She has a gift," Mary Brown remarked to John, as they observed the impromptu gathering. The healer's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The children see what we were too afraid to acknowledge." As darkness fell, Elisa began weaving tales of mountain spirits and brave travelers, stories that had once frightened the villagers, but now enchanted them. The children sat transfixed, absorbing every word as if drinking from a long-denied well. In the days that followed, the rigid boundaries that had separated John and Elisa from Hollow Creek began to crumble. Villagers nodded in greeting rather than averting their eyes. Some even stopped to exchange words about the weather or offer surplus from their gardens. Elisa's laughter, once stifled in shadows, now rang bright and clear across the valley. She moved through the village with growing confidence, her steps lighter, her voice stronger. The horseshoe charm bounced against her chest as she ran with the other children, no longer an outsider but a treasured storyteller. John watched this transformation with quiet amazement, realizing that the walls around Hollow Creek's heart were finally coming down, stone by stubborn stone. The weight of memory pressed down on John Smith as he trudged through the melting snow toward his brother's abandoned farmhouse. For years, he'd avoided this place, letting brambles and silence claim what remained of their shared history. The betrayal still stung. His brother had sided with Agnes during the feud that drove John into exile, choosing village approval over blood loyalty. Standing in the doorway, John hesitated before climbing the worn stairs. Each step creaked beneath his weight, as if the house itself protested his return. When he reached the attic, the lumberman paused, his calloused hand trembling against the splintered doorframe. This was where he'd found Elise, huddled and afraid. The connection he'd been missing suddenly crystallized. His brother's house, the girl's hiding place. There had to be a reason. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight as John knelt on the attic floor. Memories flooded back. Childhood games, shared secrets, and finally, bitter words that could never be unsaid. His brother had died before they could reconcile, taking whatever he knew about Elise to his grave. Tears carved paths through the grime on John's weathered face as he mourned not just his brother, but the family they might have been. "I should have come back sooner," he whispered to the empty room. "I should have forgiven you." His voice broke as he gathered a forgotten scarf, his brother's, and pressed it to his face, searching for some lingering scent of the past. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, John finally descended from the attic, his shoulders heavy with regret. The farmhouse held no answers, only echoes of what was lost. He secured the door behind him, a final gesture of respect for the dead. The path home wound through a stand of pines, their needles rustling in the spring breeze. Lost in thought, John almost didn't notice the small figure waiting at the bend in the trail. Elise stood quietly, her dark eyes watching him with understanding beyond her years. Without a word, she approached and slipped her small hand into his rough one. The simple gesture of trust broke something open inside him. "We build new families," Elise whispered, her voice gentle yet firm, "from the ones who choose to stay." John looked down at their joined hands, his pale and weathered, hers dark and small but equally strong. The truth of her words settled deep in his bones, warming places long grown cold. What they had built together wasn't defined by blood or the past, but by choice and courage. "Yes," he replied simply, squeezing her hand. "We do." Together they walked toward home, the setting sun painting the mountain in gold and promise. The morning frost had barely melted when Caleb Davis returned to Hollow Creek, his wagon loaded with trinkets and promises. The merchant's eyes gleamed with determination as he approached John's cabin, where Elise was helping collect kindling for the morning fire. "I've come with a final offer," Caleb announced, his voice carrying across the yard. $300 for the girl. Think of it, Smith. Enough to rebuild your life somewhere people don't whisper behind your back. John straightened, his weathered face hardening as he placed a protective hand on Elise's shoulder. The lumberman had faced many winters alone, but nothing had prepared him for the fierce protectiveness he now felt. "She's not for sale," he replied simply. "Not for any price." Undeterred, Caleb turned his attention to Elise herself. "Child, imagine the wonders waiting beyond these mountains. Silk dresses, proper schooling, audiences who would pay just to hear your strange tales. He produced a silver locket, dangling it before her. This could be the least of your treasures. Elise regarded the merchant with eyes far older than her years. My stories belong to the Ridge, she said quietly, and I belong where I choose. The commotion drew villagers from their morning chores. Harlan Johnson arrived first, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist. Mary Brown followed, her healer's bag clutched tightly in her hands. Even the children came running, forming a protective circle around Elise. You heard them, Harlan said, stepping forward. The girl stays. Caleb's smile faltered. This isn't your concern. A man has rights to what he finds on his property. She's not property, Mary interjected, her usually gentle voice firm. She's one of us now. One by one, the villagers of Hollow Creek positioned themselves between Caleb and Elise, the same people who had once crossed the street to avoid John's gaze. Agnes Johnson stood at the back, her face unreadable, but she made no move to oppose the others. Outnumbered and unwelcome, Caleb finally retreated to his wagon. You're all fools, he spat, clinging to your mountain superstitions instead of seeing opportunity. As the merchant's wagon disappeared down the winding path, John felt something shift inside him, a wound long festered, finally beginning to heal. For 20 years he had lived as an outsider in his own home, carrying the weight of old feuds and misunderstandings. Now, standing among neighbors who had chosen right over fear, John realized he had found belonging not through birthright or history, but through the simple act of standing firm when it mattered most. The first buds of spring burst from the trees, painting Hollow Creek in delicate greens and pinks. The festival of renewal arrived with a warmth that seemed to seep into the very soil of the mountain village. Fires blazed higher than in years past, the straw effigies twisting in golden flames that reached toward the stars. John Smith and Elise walked together through the celebration, her small hand firmly clasped in his weathered one. The Lenador's shoulders, once perpetually hunched against the weight of isolation, now stood straight as he nodded to those who met his gaze. Elise's laughter rang clear and unafraid, no longer a whispered secret, but a melody that belonged among the pines. They're watching us differently now, the girl observed, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The villagers approached with cautious smiles, offering small tokens, a carved wooden bird, a pouch of dried herbs, a length of bright ribbon for Elise's hair. Mary Brown stood nearby, her healer's hands steady as she directed children in weaving flower crowns. She caught John's eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come. Even Agnes Johnson, though still stiff with remnants of suspicion, had softened at the edges. The matriarch watched from her place of honor as Elise joined the children's circle dance, her movements fluid and sure. She belongs here, Agnes admitted grudgingly to Harlan as he passed by. Perhaps some changes don't break us after all. The Ferrero smiled, the horseshoe charm he'd crafted now hanging proudly around Elise's neck. The mountain bends, but doesn't break, he replied, echoing one of the girl's riddles that had become a common saying in Hollow Creek. As night deepened, John found himself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching as Elise taught the village children one of her mysterious chants. The past hadn't vanished. He could still feel its presence in the abandoned farmhouse on the ridge, in the memories of his brother, in the nightmares that sometimes woke Elise crying. But those shadows no longer ruled their lives or the spirit of Hollow Creek. The mountain's legendary silence had been broken, replaced by something far more precious, the music of children's voices rising in harmony, the crackle of communal fires, and conversations that bridged old divides. Traditions weren't discarded, but reforged, stronger for having been tested. We made it through winter, Elise said, appearing suddenly at his side. John smiled down at her. Yes, he answered simply, and spring is always worth the wait. As the year turned, John Smith stood on the ridge, watching lanterns flicker against the night sky. The winter wind no longer bit at him with the same loneliness it once had. Below, the village of Hollow Creek glowed with warmth. No longer a place that had cast him out, but a community that had, against all odds, become home again. He was no longer the bear of the ridge, that solitary figure of mountain legend, but a man remade by courage and the unexpected gift of kinship. Elise stood beside him, her small fingers wrapped around a lantern of her own. The girl who had once been a trembling shadow in an abandoned attic now walked tall among the villagers, her laughter joining the chorus of celebration. Her story, mysterious as it remained in parts, had been woven into the very heart of Hollow Creek, transforming not just her life, but the soul of the community itself. "Do you think they'll remember?" she asked, her voice carrying that familiar hint of ancient wisdom that had first captured the children's imagination. John smiled, the weathered lines around his eyes crinkling. "Some stories don't fade," he answered simply. Down in the village square, Mary Brown adjusted her new healer's apprentice's sash, a replacement for the one she had surrendered in that moment of brave truth-telling. She caught John's eye and raised her hand in greeting, the gesture a bridge across old divides. Even Agnes Johnson, though still stiff with the remnants of suspicion, had stopped warning others away from Elise's stories. The prophecy she had feared, "A child hidden in beams will crack the mountain open," had come true, but not as disaster. Instead, it had cracked open hearts long sealed by fear. Harlan approached them on the ridge, his blacksmith's hands carrying a small wooden box. "For the spring planting," he explained, offering it to Elise. Inside lay iron charms, each hammered with care, protection for the new season. The ferryman's daughter called up to Elise, waving excitedly for her to join the children's circle below. With a questioning glance at John, she received his nod and raced down the path, her footsteps sure on ground that had once seemed so foreign. John watched her go, remembering the desperate knocking that had led him to that attic, the fear in her eyes, the riddles that had slowly revealed a truth both painful and healing. The storm had passed, but its lesson lingered in every face turned toward the sky, in every hand reaching out to another. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is open your door and let the light in. And in Hollow Creek, doors that had been barred for generations now stood open to the promise of dawn.